Hello, folks. We're down the line once again from Boston tonight with political author, analyst, and historian Dr. James D. Boys. I'm Michael L. Roberts. This is the American Chronicle.
This American carnage stops right here and stops right now. China has total respect for Donald Trump and for Donald Trump's very, very large brain.
What is the evidence that it has a preventative effect?
Here we go, you ready? Here's my evidence. I get a lot of positive calls about it.
Nobody knew that healthcare could be so complicated. Vaccine or no vaccine, we're back.
It's Monday, May 25th, 2020. It's episode 10 of the American Chronicle, and with thanks as ever for your support for this series, we continue tonight to ride the waves of air on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Anchor FM, and all across the digital podsphere. The stories we'll cover in tonight's show would, at any other time, have dominated the entire episode. In the time of Trump and the corona election, they're barely surviving a single day's news cycle. But be it Saudi, Hydroxy, Pelosi, Amy, Peggy, or political demography, we've got you covered. And I began tonight's interview by asking James about the evolving intrigue of recent chronicles. I speak, of course, about the firing of Inspector General Linick, news of a Saudi-US arms deal cover-up, and the shifting significance of Mike Pompeo therein.
So we are in the midst of a continuing story, as you rightly point out. When last we spoke, the understanding was that Steve Linick was somehow removed from his post as an Inspector General because he had had the temerity to suggest and investigate the allegation that perhaps Mike Pompeo was getting some degree of public funding for dog walking, dry cleaning errands, and people doing the ironing. At one point, Donald Trump was suggesting that there was nothing wrong with this if his wife couldn't do those tasks. There was so much wrong, quite frankly, with that presidential response that I think time prohibits us going into it. Clearly, I think what is remarkable about this story, however, is the way that very quickly developed away from a tale of unsolicited public funds for dog walking into a revelation that perhaps there were darker deeds afoot, and that would involve the allegation that the Inspector General was removed from his office at the exact moment that the Foreign Affairs Committee, Eliot Engel, had asked him to start investigating weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. Very clearly, this moves it up into a whole new category of scandal, if we can use that word. The decision by the president to remove yet another Inspector General is, of course, the latest in a long line of removals of said office holders, and I think draws into very serious questions the extent to which this administration is attempting to remove the safety net, effectively, that the inspectors general have over governmental departments. We've talked in the past about the extent to which an American president can hire and fire at will. And of course, that in theory is still the case. But of course, when you're talking about individuals who are particularly hired to work within this branch of government to oversee the regulations and to make sure that those all-important checks and balances are being adhered to, it does, I think, raise very, very serious questions about the veracity of this administration, its adherence to the rule of law, and the extent to which it appears very, very willing to fire at the drop of a hat anybody, frankly, who has the audacity to challenge it and its its adherence to constitutional affairs.
In direct relation to that, on Tuesday, of course, Trump dropped his bombshell regarding his use of hydroxychloroquine to stave off the virus, qualifying the premeditated nature of the announcement by proclaiming, "I was waiting to see your eyes light up when I told you that," or something to that effect. Further distractions then came thick and fast, in particular Nancy Pelosi's comments regarding Trump's body weight, and I'm interested in your take on the extent to which the media took the distraction bait in this case.
I think that one of the most interesting elements as we go through the series of analyses of the United States during the time of Corona and under Donald Trump is the extent to which, quite frankly, every single story we talk about on a week-by-week basis should be dominating for weeks, if not months, and yet they are struggling to stay within their own time cycle, quite frankly. They are becoming quickly replaced by the next nonsensical story. The issue with regard to Mike Pompeo, for example, could and indeed should continue to grow and be investigated, and yet here we now have an American president who appears to be defying medical advice and self-medicating. The extent to which this has been done before is, and the extent to which this is a developing situation, one of great concern, I think, quite frankly, when you look at issues to do with the continuity of government, is of great importance. This is something which defies belief and medical opinion, quite frankly. He has done it seemingly without any consultation with medical practitioners. One wonders how he has managed to get hold of this medication, if indeed he has, because I would also point out that there are some people who are questioning whether he really has done this or whether he is merely thrown this story into the mix to change the subject, to try to provoke debate, discussion, for example. He has suggested that whatever suggestions there are with regard to possible side effects, and of course we've seen anchors on Fox News come out and be quite concerned about the potential side effects of this, suggesting it could they haven't quite said it could kill him, but they put this in a third person. If you take this, it could kill you.
Without round-the-clock medical attention. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Nobody seems to know quite what the long-term implications are for an American president to be taking medication without that due care and attention. This led to a diatribe by President Trump against Fox News, lambasting them for not doing everything they could be, not working for his re-election. Because it's quite astonishing, quite frankly, as though Fox News exists purely to get Donald Trump re-elected, talking about missing the great Roger Ailes. Roger Ailes, of course, who was no pun intended, trumped out of Fox News for extreme sexual misconduct and a whole host of crimes, quite frankly. When Rupert Murdoch will no longer contain you within an organization, you've got to be doing something pretty wrong, quite frankly. So it really is a remarkable situation. As if that wasn't remarkable enough, we then, of course, had Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, expressing her alarm with regard to this. Speaking, I think, for many Americans, they say, whatever we think about Donald Trump, he is the president, and he needs to be looking after himself. And she went on to suggest that, somebody who is quote unquote morbidly obese shouldn't be doing this. It's not a great idea. And this, of course, caused consternation. I think Pelosi was using the CDC definition of the term. Some degree about whether that's the case or not, but of course, if you look at weight and height, etc., that might have some degree of accuracy to it. But the question about whether the president is taking medication which has not been approved, again, I think raises a whole series of doubts about the rule of law, the adherence to regulations which the administration is telling the American citizens to abide by, and great questions about whether it is that they are doing so themselves.
To what extent do you feel that it was a premeditated distraction technique from the other stories we've been covering?
I think that if Donald Trump has a gift, it is in controlling the narrative. Since he emerged on the national scene, effectively, to run for the presidency, whatever else one thinks of Donald Trump, he has proved incredibly adept at controlling the narrative and running a narrative. And whenever the national media appears to be moving in a direction that he has not been happy with, he has had this great capacity to throw a curveball, to get the narrative changed. This happened time and time again during the 2016 presidential election, to the chagrin of Hillary Clinton's campaign. Just when they thought they had gotten an upper hand, he was able to pull something out of the fire, hold a press conference, and change the narrative. And we're seeing it on a weekly basis, quite frankly, time and time again. Whenever any news stories come up, the Pompeo story, for example, he's able to pull out of the fire effectively some extravagant claim, some story which has simply taken all the oxygen away from said story and now got a narrative moving in a different direction. Even if on occasion that makes Donald Trump look ridiculous, quite frankly, I think he adheres to the simple old adage of no news being bad news, as long as he is at the center of this. He is, as I've used this expression before, the Sun King. He has to be at the center of his own news universe, and frankly, as long as it is he that is being talked about and he's on the news, he believes, I think, that is better than not being in the news and, heaven forbid, somebody else being the center of attention. As long as he is the one whose face is on the screen, he feels that he can, I think, control the narrative and be seen as the dominant force in American politics, which of course he is.
Referencing that which you have said before on previous episodes, I'm all too delighted to acknowledge the fact that this is episode 10, and on my various government-prescribed daily walks, I've been listening back to all previous 9 episodes, in which I was surprised to realize how early on we were talking about Joe Biden's potential vice presidential pick and the fact that it would be a woman. I note this week that Amy Klobuchar has begun suitability screening, shall we say. Your comparative analysis of the veracity of that potential and the viability or lack thereof of this particular candidate, please.
So Joe Biden at the moment is having a great deal of difficulty getting any airtime whatsoever. The main way that he can do that, it seems at present, in a positive way, and we can perhaps talk about some of the other ways he's getting airtime later, is by teasing the idea of who will be his vice presidential nominee. This is not a new tactic used by presidential nominees, although it is something which usually comes a little bit later in the cycle. That it can come this early in the cycle is, it must be said, testament to Joe Biden's ability to basically nail down the nomination so very early. And in other years, that will be seen as a great sign of strength, etc., and he'd be getting a lot of traction out of it. Unfortunately, at the moment, he can't get himself out of his basement to appear before any crowds, to gee up any support, etc. So one of the ways he is attempting to get some news traction is to talk about his vice presidential nominees, and he has already said categorically that it will be a woman, and we have talked, as you've noted, about who it is that he might nominate. The latest individual to take a star turn, if you will, is Senator Amy Klobuchar, who listeners might remember is the senator from Minnesota who challenged briefly, it must be said, for the Democratic nomination before flaming out and eventually throwing her weight behind Joe Biden. Now, on one level, she seems like a pretty good choice. She is someone who has decent name recognition. She's from Minnesota, which obviously counts as the sort of the Midwest area there. So that's a good part of the American heartland for a Democrat to be going after. She is not unattractive. She appears well on national television. She is seen as a decent debater. She's someone who I think ran a decent campaign, although not a successful campaign for the nomination for the presidency. So on those levels, she seems to tick a number of boxes. Where she comes up shy is that a vice presidential nominee needs to do several things. First of all, most importantly, they have to help the presidential nominee get elected in the first place. And the most tangible way they can do that is to deliver their home state. Now, Amy Klobuchar is going to deliver Minnesota because Minnesota has voted for the Democratic nominee for president every cycle since Richard Nixon in 1972. But that isn't actually helping Joe Biden because those figures alone suggest that with or without Amy Klobuchar, he will carry Minnesota. So that isn't necessarily a positive, I don't think. Neither, quite frankly, is her whiteness. Joe Biden is making a big play for the black vote come November, and we are starting to see pushback from the African American community about the fact that of all the women he could choose as his vice presidential nomination, the very first name out of the hat to apparently get an FBI screening is Amy Klobuchar. And the black community is pushing back, suggesting that by choosing her, he could very well risk losing the African American vote come November because of her previous time working within Minnesota, which many people feel was not conducive to the African American community in that state. So at a time when Joe Biden is desperately attempting to shore up key basic groups within the Democratic constituency, he needs to make sure that he doesn't alienate the black vote. And it's very clear, I think, that one of the ways he might do that is by nominating a white female nominee for the vice presidency at a time when the African American community, I think, feel that there is ample opportunity to put a woman of color in that position.
So, as usual, you've sparked me to alter my scope and range of questions. As it were, I was going to end with an inevitable question in any analysis of this week, which would be an examination of Joe Biden's potential basket of deplorables moment. I refer, of course, to Hillary in 2016 decrying Trump supporters as a basket of deplorables, and in this case, Joe Biden this week saying to the Breakfast Club host Charlemagne the God, "Well, I tell you what, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black." What does this statement tell us about Biden, the Democrats, their reliance on demographic loyalty, and their blind spots therein?
In 2016, there was a very strange dynamic at play that went a little bit like this. The polling appeared to favor, on a rolling day-by-day basis, that candidate who spoke less, who appeared less, which is to say that the candidate on a day-to-day basis doing worse was the one who was dominating the news cycle, because they tended to be in the news for all the wrong reasons. A case being, for example, the famous Access Hollywood tape recording of Donald Trump. That became news for 5 minutes and had a huge impact upon Donald Trump's polling in a negative fashion. We're actually seeing something similar happen in 2020, by which I mean that we spoke earlier in this conversation about Joe Biden and his enforced campaigning from his basement. On the one level, that seems like a terrible idea, that Joe Biden is being forced to campaign from his basement. And yet, the more one studies Joe Biden's campaign, the more one wonders whether that might not be a blessing in disguise, quite frankly. Because, quite frankly, and I'm not trying to echo Donald Trump's talking points here, but the president has a point when he says to the effect that whenever Joe Biden opens his mouth, it's only to change feet and to get himself into greater trouble. President Trump, within the last 48 hours, was asked about Joe Biden's assets and liabilities as a presidential candidate. And Trump said something to the effect of, well, his track record in office should be an asset, but quite frankly, he wondered whether Biden could remember, quite frankly, what he was saying yesterday. Well, what he was saying yesterday, as you rightly point out, was deeply offensive to many people within the African American community, and rightly so, suggesting that if you're a member of the African American community and you don't vote for Joe Biden, then you must be insane or aren't black enough, quite frankly. This is a remarkable statement. It really is. It heavily undermines everything that has won Joe Biden the nomination, quite frankly. He would not have won it without the support of the African American community, starting, of course, in South Carolina, where Amy Klobuchar, who we were speaking about earlier on, only managed to gain 1% of the votes in that state, in part because of her lack of support from the black community. The Democratic Party cannot win the presidency in 2020 without the support of the black community. That was made very, very clear 4 years ago when the black vote was down by some 5% across the board, which was one of the contributing factors leading to Hillary Clinton's failure to win the presidency. Right. If that happens again, Donald Trump gets a second term. And 4 years ago, Donald Trump quite famously said to the African American community, what have you got to lose? What have you got to lose by voting for me, voting for a Republican? You effectively, the black community, have been voting for Democrats for years and years and years. And what has it got you? Nothing. They take you for granted, he said. And quite frankly, I think that Joe Biden has played directly into Donald Trump's hands, which is what Donald Trump is very, very good at. Not only will he now politicize this moving forward, they are also monetarizing this, because if you go to the Donald Trump for re-election campaign website, they are actually selling T-shirts for $30 a piece with this slogan on there, mocking Joe Biden and constantly drawing attention to the fact that the Democratic Party are seen to have been taking the black vote for granted. And of course, now Biden has had to come out and apologize for this. It's not helping. He's sort of saying, "Oh well, the NAACP have backed me every time I run for office," and of course now the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, have come out and said, "Well, that isn't true." It seems like every time, quite frankly, Joe Biden is talking at the moment, he's getting himself into further trouble. So the lockdown could very well be having a positive impact for Joe Biden if it can just stop him from talking himself into all kinds of trouble.
I think I was reading on that bunker approach to running a presidential campaign, Peggy Noonan, I think it was in 2005, saying that America could do with a kind of front porch presidential campaign run. What are your thoughts on the value of that beyond that which you've already suggested in terms of Biden and his bunker approach, and how that might change the face of presidential running in America?
So once upon a time, people did not run for the presidency. They stood for the presidency. And in case anybody thinks I'm being caustic or splitting hairs, what I mean by that is that in the current era, politicians are running for the presidency for anything up to 2 years, quite frankly, in some cases. Whereas once upon a time, if you will, candidates were not seen to want the office. It was seen to be unseemly to seek the office. You would stay at home. You would begrudgingly allow your name to go forward if it was in the best interests of the country. And that, well, if I'm nominated, I will allow my name to go forward. And if I am accepted, then I will sort of begrudgingly agree to serve if I am elected, if it is the will of the people. And we saw throughout much of the 18th and 19th century this kind of approach to seeking the presidency. That seems very quaint now, let's be honest about it. We live in an era and an age, and we have done for at least 60, 70 years, where the razzmatazz of American political life has been almost taken for granted. The huge spectacle of the huge rallies which politicians have engaged in now over 5 or 6 decades, the money's involved, the scope of these events. Some might remember, for example, in 2008, when Barack Obama was nominated for the Democratic Party, the scope of that nomination process was so large that it expanded outside of a normal arena into a football field. It was a huge occasion, quite frankly. And with the emergence of the coronavirus, that, of course, has threatened to put all that kind of an approach into retreat, because now, of course, just a normal convention at an arena, for example, say, for example, the TD Garden here in Boston, which has hosted such political conventions in the past, appears to be impossible at this point, unless there is a sudden change, it must be said, in the political dynamics. So if the parties cannot have the nomination process go forward at a normal convention, if the nominees themselves cannot get out onto the road and hold political rallies, as we would usually be seeing at this point, what is the way forward? Well, the way forward appears to be taking a leaf out of Peggy Noonan's book, which is to go back to the founding principles, effectively, which is to effectively stay home and to, in Biden's case, I guess, speak directly to political supporters over the internet, to host web speeches which can try to gee up support. But it is a remarkable situation we find ourselves in, one which 6 months ago would have been unimaginable, quite frankly. And the only question now, I think, is how long are we in this situation? When will we next have a presidential convention? What will happen, for example? A lot of people are asking, well, there's a lot of speculation at the moment going around that President Trump might somehow try to prevent the election. He's casting doubts over the veracity of polling. But one thing which people aren't asking is, if there is no interference with the election, if it goes through perfectly okay, there has to be an inaugural in January, on January 20th, 2021. There's going to be an inauguration. How is that going to occur? Usually an inaugural is a huge event. Administrations might, dispute the numbers of people who turn up for them, whether they're record-breaking or not. But irrespective of whoever the president is, tens of thousands of people usually gather on the Mall in Washington, D.C. to attend the inaugural of a president. Whether that's Donald Trump's second inaugural or Joe Biden's first is irrespective. This is going to be planned and paid for, and monies will be raised for it. It would be remarkable if that was not to happen. Now, we've seen inaugurals cancelled in terms of the razzmatazz of it before because of bad weather. Ronald Reagan's second inaugural was moved to the interior of the Capitol building because it was so cold in January 1985 that it was feared that there would be a risk to public health. I imagine that as things stand at present, we're going to be in a very similar situation, which is that whoever wins in November, there is going to be a very different kind of inaugural address given that we have seen in the last, 35 years.
That's it for episode 10 of the American Chronicle. And with thanks as ever to you, our listeners, to James, of course, and to Chris Warner for our theme tune, we say good night, good luck, and ever onward to you all.